Thank you, Eli, for bringing us up to date and for almost touching the political meaning of the Balfour Declaration, which we almost evaded throughout this day and a half. But in order not to go too near the danger area, we are going back to the origins of the Balfour Declaration with a lecture by Professor Danielle Goodwin. Dani is an associate professor of modern Jewish history and Israel studies at the University of Haifa. His research focuses on the socio-economic analysis of the Jewish modernization, in Israeli history in general. His publications deal with Jewish nationalism, mainly Zionism, socialist Zionism, and some aspects of modern anti-Semitism. Likewise, he offers us a socio-economic analysis of the political, ideological, and cultural history of Israel, with special emphasis on the neoliberal era. Like Eli before him, Dani Gutwein is also often in the public sphere, expressing his views and writing about issues of the day. The topic of his lecture, and I am curious to see what it actually means in the end, is the political logic of the Balfour Declaration, the limits of British Zionist cooperation. Perhaps we close a circle and come back to Professor Pedersen's lecture.
Thank you very much. As Professor Volkov told me, I have much more time than I have imagined, so I'll read my lecture at... well, it's something like double the time I thought that I had. And I will extend in certain points. I would like to make three comments on the political logic of the publication of the Balfour Declaration. And what I am dealing with is the publication of the declaration, not the outcome of the declaration, not mandate, the British, Jewish, Arab conflicts, and so on. I'm concentrated on what happened in Britain in 1917, in 1916, and that will be the focus of my talk. First, I will deal with the unresolved question of what were the real motives behind the Balfour Declaration. The real ones, I will tell you what they were. Contrary to accepted readings, the Balfour Declaration was... But contrary to the accepted readings, the Balfour Declaration was not meant to enlist Zionist or Jewish influence in Russia or in the US in support of British war interests. British officials knew that the Zionists were incapable to persuade the Russians to stay in the war or to put pressure on President Wilson to support the British conquest of Palestine. This is very important because the Zionists did not have the force that is generally attributed to them and making it the cause of the declaration. All the parties involved in the publication of the declaration knew perfectly well that neither Weizmann nor other Zionists could persuade nor the Russians or the Americans. And that brings us back to the question, why did the British publish the declaration? Furthermore, the idea of a pro-Zionist declaration was considered by the British administration since 1915. But despite its alleged propagandistic and political advantages, it was repeatedly rejected, including by Balfour himself. Indeed, had it depended on Balfour, the Balfour Declaration would have never been published. What was then the political logic of the Balfour Declaration? In the diplomatic context of the autumn of 1917, it was clear that a British promise to facilitate the establishment facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, was meant to end the Turkish sovereignty in Palestine as a first step in dismantling the Ottoman Empire, partitioning territories among the Entente powers, and the annexation of Palestine to the British Empire. In other words, a declaration of support for Jewish national home in Palestine was in fact a statement of British policy regarding the future of the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. This policy statement, and not the vague promises that have been made to the Zionists, was the essence of the Balfour Declaration and the real goal of its publication. As a statement of policy, the Balfour Declaration actually determined the first struggle regarding the British policy in the Middle East, a struggle that had split the British political elite throughout the war into two rival factions. The first faction strove to preserve the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire while reforming its regime and administration, which actually meant removing Turkey from the war by diplomatic means. I'll refer to this faction that was led by Prime Minister Asquith and later by Lord Balfour as the reformist faction, because they wanted to reform the Ottoman Empire, not to dismember it. The second faction strove to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and divide its territories between the Entente powers. As a means of consolidation British hold in the Middle East, I refer to this faction that was led by David Lloyd George as the radical faction. That's because they want to change the Middle East radically. In the context of this inter-faction struggle, the Balfour Declaration clearly articulated the radical policy. It acknowledged that Britain was pushing towards the partition of the Ottoman Empire, and thus the publication of the declaration was intended to frustrate the reformist effort and end the war with a peace agreement that would preserve Ottoman territorial integrity. Now, we have to remember that throughout 1917, there was major efforts had been made by President Wilson and other parties to persuade Turkey to get out of the war by diplomatic agreement, a diplomatic agreement that will give Turkey the permanent rule of the Middle East. And it was understood that if you want to get Turkey out of the war by diplomatic means, you have to promise that you will not partition it. So the question of partitioning or not partitioning had great influence on the diplomatic side of the war, because if you give the Balfour Declaration meant that Britain is going to partition the Ottoman Empire, and by this it put an end to all these diplomatic efforts, and of course paved the way to a military conquest of the Middle East by the Entente powers.
Can you speak to the mic?
I'm speaking to the mic. Maybe there is something with the mic. Up to the end of 1916, as long as Asquith and the Reformists were in power, the Zionists failed to persuade the British government to support their aspirations in Palestine. The situation, however, completely changed in early 1917 after Lloyd George, who succeeded Asquith as Prime Minister in December 1916, adopted British policy in the Middle East to the radical agenda. The radical victory, however, was only partial. Lloyd George government contained a strong reformist opposition led by the Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour. Likewise, the American President Woodrow Wilson led strict reformist policy and worked to achieve peace without victory with Turkey that would prevent the partition of the Ottoman territories in the Middle East, with the growing dependence of Britain on the American assistance after the US joined the war in April 1917, Wilson's policy increasingly strengthened Balfour and the British reformists. The architect of Lloyd George's radical policy was Sir Mark Sykes, who was involved in shaping the British policy in the Middle East since the beginning of the war. Of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is only one of his deeds. In advancing the radical agenda, Sykes focused on two major obstacles. First, fighting what he defined as the pro-Turkish gang in the Foreign Office, namely Balfour and his reformist officials. So, Sykes, he was very determined that within the British Foreign Office operated a pro-Turkish gang. He used other words, the Baghdad Railway gang, and so on. They were pro-German, pro-Turkish. They wanted to end the war with a diplomatic agreement and so on. That was contrary to the radical agenda, and Sykes was very determined to fight these inclinations. So, fighting the pro-Turkish gang in the Foreign Office. Second, Sykes was focusing on bypassing President Wilson's opposition to the radical effort to expand the British Empire in the Middle East. To bypass Wilson's opposition, Sykes developed a deceptive strategy, pointing to the president's recognition of the right of the small nations in Europe to self-determination. He expanded this principle to the Ottoman Asian territories, namely to the Middle East. To carry out this national strategy of dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the radicals became the champions of the national aspirations of what they defined as the ancient nations of the Middle East, namely the Arabs, the Armenians, and the Jews. Supporting their respective national movements, the radical advocated the establishment of an Arab, Armenian, and Jewish nation states under the protectorate of the Entente powers. So this was the idea, using the national element that became more and more legitimate in Europe in order to partition the Ottoman Empire through helping Zionists, Arabs, Armenians to establish their respective nation states. That was Sykes' idea and the radical agenda in 1917. In this political context, British support of the Zionist national aspirations in Palestine became a de facto British declaration of the future dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, partition its territories, and the annexation of Palestine to the British Empire. This political significance turned the publication of a pro-Zionist declaration into a bone of contention between the reformists and the radicals. From the early stages of the war, the reformists were ready to support certain cultural and municipal rights of the Jews in Ottoman Palestine after the war, but they rejected any recognition of their national rights there, recognition that would mean support for the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And indeed, Asquith and his reformist administration strongly opposed any pro-Zionist declaration because of its radical implications and turned down all the initiatives to publish such a declaration. Lloyd George's radical administration brought about a complete change of policy. Now, Sykes worked to promote the radical agenda through pro-Zionist declaration that would mark the defeat of the reformists. That was exactly why the reformists continued to oppose the declaration. Balfour, who led the reformist opposition in Lloyd George government, was fully aware of their political weakness and his limitation as foreign secretary. Accordingly, Balfour developed an indirect strategy of fighting Lloyd George anti-Turkish policy. He advanced the reformist agenda through President Wilson and blocked the radicals by disrupting their initiatives, including that of a pro-Zionist declaration. The debates after the declaration of the War Cabinet, which began in early September, was focused on the term national home, which both the radicals and the reformists considered to be the essence of the declaration. A Jewish national home in Palestine meant an end to Turkish sovereignty there, and as such, it was a first step in dismantling the Ottoman Empire. Accordingly, Lord Milner, a reformist cabinet member, worked to remove the term national from the declaration draft, and was successful in changing the wording of the promise to just a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a promise that would be realized under a reformed Ottoman Empire as well. So it is very important. The text that was first dealt by the British cabinet was not for a home, not for a national home. And that exactly because of the meaning of that home in the context of the radical reformist contest. The reformists were not satisfied with just changing the wording of the proposed declaration. At the same time, they worked to frustrate the policy that informed it. In early September, they were successful in postponing the decision on the declaration, and Balfour used this delay as a pretext to suspend any further discussion of its publication. In this juncture, Lloyd George made it clear that he was determined to publish the declaration and would not tolerate any further delay or any kind of obstructionism. Accordingly, the discussion on the declaration was resumed and the wording was changed again to national home. So we see that the cabinet became a ground of war between Lloyd George and Balfour. Balfour wanted this reformist policy, if possible, not to publish the declaration at all, if publishing it only in a mild wording, while Lloyd George was pushing for the full declaration. The decision to issue the pro-Zionist declaration was finally accepted at October 31st, and on November 2nd, it became ironically to be known as the Balfour Declaration. In the next 2 decades, the importance of the declarations was laid in the promise it made to the Zionists. But in the immediate British political context, the declaration had another emphasis that was the real reason for its publication. It was an official statement of His Majesty government that His Majesty government had decided to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, to partition its territories and make Palestine a British protectorate. The radical support of Zionism served, therefore, as a pretext for dissolving the Ottoman Empire and as a camouflage for advancing British imperialism in the Middle East. This radical policy informed the British support of Arab nationalism as well. Thus, Lawrence's Arab Revolt and the Balfour Declaration were 2 sides of the same coin of policy. And we have to remember it. But the Balfour Declaration and the Arab Revolt was the same using of Jews and Arabs to promote British imperialism in the Middle East. And Balfour Declaration and the revolt of Lawrence and the Sharif family gave birth to the Arab nationalism in Iraq, in Syria, Transjordan, all these places. The Palestinians were left out because they weren't considered there as a nation. The Arab nationalism was elsewhere. That's why the Palestinians are mentioned in the declaration only as private people whose rights should be preserved. My second comment deals with another unresolved question. what was the role played by Chaim Weizmann in the publication of the Balfour Declaration. The difficulty to explain Weizmann's involvement has led to some historians to argue that the declaration was a British interest and they would have published it anyway, and accordingly Weizmann had no substantial contribution to its publication. However, as I have previously shown, the declaration was not a British interest, but a radical policy. This British interfactional struggle over the declaration, which informs my interpretation, is the key for the analysis of Weizmann's contribution to the publication of the Balfour Declaration. During the war, Weizmann acted both as a Zionist leader and as a British radical statesman. The current historiography overlooks this duality and thus completely misses the reason of his influence on the publication of the Declaration. From early 1915, at the advice of Baron Edmond de Rothschild from Paris, who in accordance with the Rothschild financial and political interest held clear radical views, Weizmann supported the radical policy and considered British Palestine as the only way to realize Zionist aspirations. Accordingly, during the war, Weizmann worked to intertwine Zionist ideas with radical goals. More specifically, Weizmann has used the future Zionist colonization of Palestine to persuade hesitant British politicians and opinion leaders to support the radical agenda. Weizmann was aware of the reservation in various liberal circles concerning the desirability of increasing the British military and imperial responsibilities in the Middle East. In response, Weizmann emphasized that the Zionist settlement in Palestine could be a solution for the concerns regarding the cost of expanding British imperial commitment. Thus, Weizmann proposed to Charles P. Scott, editor of the Manchester Guardian, and Lloyd George, and the closest confidant of Lloyd George, that Britain should adopt in Palestine the protectorate model that it had established in Egypt. The Jews would take over the country and establish and equip an efficient militia there, which under British leadership would be sufficiently strong to defend British Palestine. Weizmann further suggested that the Jews would take care of all the burden of organization and finance of the British protectorate in Palestine. He maintained that by depicting Zionism as the frontier guard of British Palestine, the radicals could bypass the concern and reservation of those liberals who didn't oppose imperial expansion in principle, but were reluctant to pay its military and financial price. What is very interesting here, that we all aware of Zev Jabotinsky, revisionist politics. And when I read these pieces of Weizmann, at the beginning, I thought that I was mistaken, that I was reading the Iron Ore of Jabotinsky. It's the same text. It is fascinating to find in 1915 Weizmann text that is predating the Iron Wall of Jabotinsky. Later, I will come back to Jabotinsky-Weizmann relations here. Weizmann believed that by turning the Jewish settlement in Palestine into a part and parcel of the radical agenda was the best way to guarantee the political realization of Zionism after the war. And indeed, in his political context, in 1915 and 1916, Weizmann acted more than as a radical statement than as a Zionist leader. Thus, while Weizmann positions provoked opposition among the reformists, they formed the basis for close cooperation with the radical leadership. Under the Lloyd George radical government, and that used Armenians under Lloyd George's radical government, that used the Armenians, Arabs, and Jewish national movements to frustrate President Wilson's reformist policy, Weizmann officially became part of the British administration. Thus, Weizmann was sent as British official delegate, to talk in Gibraltar with Henry Morgenthau, President Wilson's envoy, who was in his way to the Middle East to negotiate a peace treaty with Turkey. Initially, Balfour intended to send a reformist diplomat, but as a result of Sykes' radical victory over the pro-Turkish gang in the Foreign Office, Balfour had to nominate a radical representative, and Weizmann was sent to Gibraltar. Weizmann identified the change in the reformist radical balance of power in the early summer of 1917, and together with Lord Rothschild, his radical associate, they officially raised the demand for a pro-Zionist declaration that now, under the radical hegemony, for the first time, was politically viable. My third comment deals with the reaction of Weizmann's radical policy to the reactions to Weizmann's radical policy in the Zionist movement. The standard historiographies of the Balfour Declaration rightfully point that Weizmann's pro-British policy contradicted the formal neutrality declared by the World Zionist Organization at the beginning of the war, and raised a lot of resentment in certain official Zionist circles. More important, however, were the objections that Weizmann's radical policy raised among the British Zionists. Thus, Moses Guster, the rabbi of the Sephardi and Portuguese congregation in London and one of the leaders of the British Zionists, opposed Weizmann's radicalism on strictly reformist ground. Guster opposed an exclusive British rule in Palestine and preferred a joint British-German rule there over the possibility of British-French rule. Likewise, he warned that the Zionists should not rely only on Britain, which he emphasized would be a dangerous game in view of England's dire prospects in the war. A more pointed intra-Zionist critique of Weizmann's radicalism was made against his anti-Turkish and pro-imperialist implications of his alliance with the radical. Thus, Harry Zucker, one of his most closest confidants, attacked Weizmann's opposition to the idea of a separate peace with Turkey and stated, "I myself would not buy a British protectorate at the cost of prolonging the war by a single day." Above all, Zucker vigorously attacked the identification created by Weizmann between the realization of the Zionist vision and British imperial interest, and warned, "I see the peril that we Zionists in England may be infected with imperialism at the very time when the rest of the world is beginning to cast it off." While Weizmann rejected Zucker's criticism before the publication of the declaration, he would increasingly endorse it after the war, and in his policy later known as Weizmannism. Thus, in the immediate period after the publication of the declaration, Weizmann distances himself from its radical imperialistic assumptions, a policy that was the source of confrontation with his past associate and future rival, Zev Jabotinsky. Indeed, contrary to the anti-British appearances of revisionist policy, it was Jabotinsky and not Weizmann who remained loyal to the spirit of the Balfour Declaration. The history of the Balfour Declaration is marked then by a remarkable transformation. Balfour, who in 1917 did everything he could to frustrate the publication of the declaration, had later become its champion. while Weizmann, who fought for the decision in 1970s, later distanced himself from its assumptions. It seems that this later turnabout is one of the major reasons for the confusion that marks the historiography of the Declaration. I believe that the clarification of the political logic behind the Declaration can and should open a new venue for the discussion of its history in 1917 and later on.